I never planned for things to end the way they did, but from the moment I stepped into that world, I could feel the ground shifting beneath me, like every handshake and every smile was hiding something sharp just beneath the surface. People assumed I was there to play along, to accept my place and keep quiet. But what they didn't know was that I had been keeping score from the very beginning. Every word they spoke, every calculated move they made, every glance they thought went unnoticed. I remembered it all. And while they believed they were in control, they were already walking straight into something they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. If you want to see how it unfolded, how the smallest decisions turned into the kind of ending no one could reverse, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think will happen before it all comes apart. I sat deep in my leather armchair that had molded itself to my frame over decades of use, the steady tick of the mantel clock marking another quiet evening in my house. The warm lamplight pooled across the pages of my newspaper, the faint scent of brewed coffee from earlier lingering in the air. The world outside was calm. I had earned these moments of peace after a lifetime of long days and hard decisions. My reading glasses rested on my nose as I skimmed an article about Florida's escalating property taxes, a trend I'd predicted years before. I was tracing a figure in the margins when the front door swung open with a suddenness that cut the stillness in half. There was no knock, no pause, just the push of a spring breeze and the quick click of heels against my floor, and then Sharon was in my living room. She didn't just walk in. She came in as though the space belonged to her, her energy filling it like a gust of hot air before a summer storm. "Dad, this is it. The deal I've been telling you about. The one that's going to change everything," she said, her words quick and brimming with that dangerous mix of confidence and urgency. I slowly folded my newspaper in half, setting on the side table, and leaned back with deliberate calm, my voice even and steady. "Good evening to you too, Sharon." She barely heard me, her eyes shining with that look she always got when she believed she had stumbled upon the opportunity of a lifetime. She began pacing the length of the room, painting the air with her hands as she spoke. "A real estate syndicate, Dad. This isn't just talk. We're talking guaranteed returns, serious investors, properties with actual deeds in hand." She said it like she was delivering gospel, each phrase landing like a carefully rehearsed line. I'd seen this before, too many times before. I rose from my chair with the unhurried weight of someone who knew exactly where this was going. I walked toward the study corner, my footsteps slow enough to make her pause in her pitch. Her eyes flicked to me with a quick flash of apprehension, the way a gambler might glance at a dealer reaching for the discard pile. I opened the bottom drawer of my file cabinet and pulled out the thick manila folder marked Sharon Investments 2016-2024. It had been sitting there for years, swelling with every ill-fated venture she'd thrown herself into. Without saying a word, I carried it back to the coffee table and began laying the contents out in a neat, merciless row. She kept talking over the sound of the papers hitting the wood. 15% returns, maybe 20 if we catch the right wave. Her voice was bright, insistent. I looked her in the eye and said, like the Tampa condos were different. My hand slid the glossy brochure toward her, the one with turquoise water and sunlit balconies that had promised so much and delivered nothing. $80,000 gone before the first concrete was poured, the developer vanishing into the wind. She flinched but recovered quickly, moving to stand at the far edge of the table. I reached for the next file, the cryptocurrency mining equipment scam. $50,000 wired to a man she'd met on an online forum, convinced she was investing in the future of money. The supplier's professional-looking website had vanished overnight, taking her investment with it. I placed the bank statements and email exchanges in front of her, watching her jaw tighten. "You never trust me," she snapped, her voice sharp and rising. Every time I try to build something, you throw these in my face like I'm some kind of fool. I crouched beside the front passenger tire and ran my hand along the sidewall until my fingertip caught on a sharp edge. A roofing nail, silver and unmistakable, was lodged at a precise angle just above the tread, the same type I kept in my workshop for patch jobs. I pulled it out and studied the clean puncture it left behind, and then I went around the car, finding the same pattern on each wheel, 4 tires for nails, each placed with care to cause maximum damage. It wasn't vandalism by chance. It was deliberate, methodical, and meant to sideline my car completely. I straightened up and looked toward the street, the early sunlight casting long shadows over the quiet neighborhood. There was no one out except Mrs. Henderson, sitting on her porch in her usual wicker chair, wrapped in a light shawl, her gaze aimed somewhere past me. I raised a hand in greeting, but she didn't move, and I decided not to say anything yet. Instead, I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled to Sharon's number, and pressed call. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with the kind of sleep you fake when you want to sound innocent. "Dad, what's wrong?" "It's barely 9 in the morning." I told her what I'd found, the 4 nails, the clean punctures, the certainty this wasn't an accident. She gasped just enough to sound rehearsed and said, "That's terrible. Probably neighborhood kids. You know how they get during spring break." I kept my voice measured, refusing to hand her the satisfaction of my anger. "All 4 tires, Sharon. Professional job. Nails driven in at the exact angle to ensure they couldn't be patched." There was a pause on the line, the kind where the silence itself feels heavy. "Are you accusing me of something?" she asked, her tone shifting to wounded disbelief. It was the same tone I'd heard before when she'd been caught lying about gambling losses or misusing money from one of her doom ventures. "Just checking if you saw anything unusual when you left last night," I said, making my words sound casual even though my pulse was climbing. "Strange cars, people walking around." She exhaled sharply. "I drove straight home, Dad. Look, I know we had words yesterday, but I would never do something like that. This is vandalism. You should call the police." I weighed the thought in silence. I could have pushed her, asked again, cornered her until the cracks showed, but proof mattered more than suspicion, and proof was what I didn't have, not yet. "I'll handle it through insurance," I said finally. "Thanks for the concern." "Dad, wait," she added, a hint of forced gentleness seeping into her voice. "I'm sorry about yesterday, about everything. We both said things we didn't mean." I let her words hang there for a moment, then said, "We'll talk later. I need to call AAA." After we hung up, I called roadside assistance and was told it would be 45 minutes before the tow truck arrived. I stood there staring at my crippled car, the metallic taste of betrayal creeping into my mouth. The breeze carried the smell of Mrs. Henderson's lilacs from next door, the same scent I'd always found calming. But today it was wasted against the taut wire of suspicion tightening in my chest. Had I been wrong? Maybe this was some stupid prank by local kids. Maybe the timing was a coincidence. But 40 years in construction had trained me to spot patterns, and the precision of those nails told me exactly what kind of person had put them there. Someone who knew how to make damage look like bad luck. When the tow truck finally pulled up, the mechanic stepped out, gave the tires a quick once-over, and confirmed what I already knew. These weren't random punctures. They were deliberate, and replacing all 4 would cost me $800. I paid him to take the car to Morrison's Tire Center and went back inside, making myself a turkey sandwich I barely tasted. The driver nodded a greeting, confirmed the address, and we pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching over the small bits of gravel scattered across the asphalt from where my car had been worked on earlier. The ride was quiet except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional turn signal click as we navigated through the calm streets of Lewin. The sun was dipping lower, casting long streaks of gold and orange across the houses we passed, and try to take that as a good sign, telling myself that maybe tonight would be different. When the taxi slowed in front of Sharon's house, I immediately noticed something unusual. There were more cars lining the street than I expected for what she described as a small family dinner. SUVs, luxury sedans, and a couple of sleek sports cars were parked bumper to bumper along the curb. The sound of laughter and music drifted from the backyard, carried on the mild evening air, and I could smell something savory. Barbecue, maybe, mixed with the unmistakable scent of professionally prepared dishes. As I stepped onto the brick walkway, the front door swung open before I could even knock. Sharon stood there, wearing a fitted emerald dress that shimmered slightly in the light spilling from the chandelier above her. Her smile was broad, almost too broad, and for a moment I thought she was going to hug me, but instead she took the gift from my hand and said, "Dad, you made it. Come in, come in." Inside, the transformation was startling. The modest furnishings I remembered had been replaced or at least rearranged to showcase new, expensive-looking pieces. A crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling where there had only been a simple light fixture before, casting prismatic reflections across the living room walls. Through the wide archway into the kitchen, I caught sight of a spread that looked like it belonged in a high-end catering catalog. Silver serving trays piled with roasted meats, platters of delicate hors d'oeuvres, and bottles of wine with labels I recognized from fine dining restaurants. Guests I didn't know, young professionals in tailored suits and cocktail dresses, mingled easily, their conversations floating in and out of my hearing. Sharon introduced me to a few, each shaking my hand with polite interest when they learned I had run a successful construction business for decades. Then Miles appeared from the crowd, his face lighting up the way it always did when he saw me. "Grandpa," he said, wrapping me in a hug that felt warmer and more genuine than anything else I'd encountered since I stepped through the door. I asked about school, and he told me finals were coming, but he was doing fine. He offered to get me a drink, saying, "Dad, stock your favorite beer," and disappeared toward the kitchen before I could answer. Sharon reappeared with Elliot at her side, a man whose smile never quite reaches eyes. "Remember this one, Dad?" Sharon said, holding out an imported bottle I had indeed ordered at a Portland steakhouse last year. "We thought you'd enjoy it tonight." I accepted it, nodding, oddly touched by the small detail she'd remembered, though it didn't erase the unease curling in the back of my mind. I let myself be drawn into conversations, answering polite questions about my years in construction, the kinds of projects I'd handled, the changes I'd seen in the industry. I sipped my beer, and each time my glass was nearly empty, Sharon or Elliot appeared to refill it. After a while, the alcohol softened my shoulders, and I felt myself loosening, though not enough to miss the subtle oddities. There were too many guests for a family dinner. The catering alone must have cost thousands, not counting the wine, the furniture, and the decor. I knew Sharon's financial picture well enough to know she couldn't afford this without outside help, or some hidden source of funds she hadn't mentioned. Miles returned to sit beside me, chatting about a psychology class he liked and some project he was working on, his presence a comforting reminder of why I'd come tonight. Eventually, Sharon clinked a glass and stood to make a toast. Even as I pulled my phone from my pocket to call a taxi, my eyes lifted instinctively back toward the house, where behind the sheer curtain I caught a glimpse of Miles still at the window, his outline faint, but his stillness speaking louder than words. He didn't move until I raised my hand slightly, a signal that I was leaving, and only then did his shoulders seem to relax. The taxi arrived in minutes, its headlights sweeping across Sharon's manicured lawn and the expensive cars lined along the street. As I slid into the back seat, I told the driver my address and felt the engine rumble to life beneath me, but the quiet hum of the ride didn't settle my mind. My hands rested on my knees, and for the first few blocks, I stared at the streetlights passing in steady intervals, their glow washing over the cab's interior in brief pulses. My thoughts looped back to the moments before I left. Sharon's sudden appearance at my side, her arm brushing mine as she handed me another drink, her voice honeyed and insistent about showing me the renovations upstairs. Elliot joining in almost instantly, talking about marble countertops, imported fixtures, and how they designed the master suite to feel like a luxury hotel. Both of them grinning too much, their eyes too intent on mine, their timing too perfect. It had been Miles's interruption that cut through that haze, his voice low but sharp, his grip on my arm more urgent than anything he'd ever shown me before. "Trust me, something's wrong," he'd said, and I had trusted him without hesitation. I tried to imagine what would have happened if he hadn't been there, if I had followed Sharon and Elliot up those stairs. In my mind's eye, I saw a guest bedroom turned into a temporary office, a table with neatly stacked papers, maybe a lawyer sitting and waiting under the pretense of witnessing a signature for some benign-sounding document. I imagined my name written in ink under a contract that transferred everything I'd built over 40 years into their control, the drinks blurring the edges of my awareness enough to make me think it was all harmless. The thought made my jaw clench. I knew Sharon could be reckless, but this felt colder, more calculated, like a plan put into motion days before I even walked through her front door tonight. The cab turned onto Maple Street, and I watched the familiar landmarks roll by. But instead of the usual comfort, they felt like backdrops to a stage I'd just walked off, narrowly avoiding whatever act had been waiting for me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and when I pulled it out, I saw Miles's name. I answered immediately, my voice low, even though the driver probably wasn't listening. "Grandpa, are you okay? Are you safe?" His voice was tense, the words spilling out fast. "I'm fine," I said, glancing out the window as if the night could overhear us. "I'm in a taxi heading home." "What was happening back there, Miles? Why did you warn me?" There was a pause on the line, and I could hear the faint sounds of the party in the background before a door closed and muffled them. "I overheard Mom and Dad talking yesterday," he said finally, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They had some plan involving you in tonight's party." "What kind of plan?" I asked, already bracing for the answer I suspected was coming. "They wanted to get you drunk and make you sign business documents. Something about transferring your company to Dad." There were lawyers upstairs in the guest bedroom, waiting. Mom kept checking the time, and Dad kept making sure you were drinking enough. I knew if I didn't say something, they'd get you up there. I felt the blood in my veins turn cold. "Are you certain about this?" "Grandpa, I heard them. Mom said you were being selfish, keeping all that money when Dad needed it for his investments. She said older people get confused when they drink, that you'd sign anything they put in front of you." The blunt cruelty of her words stung more than I cared to admit, not just for the insult, but for the casual way she had dismissed everything I'd worked for, reducing it to something she could take with the right combination of alcohol and legal trickery. "How much did you overhear?" Yet now, those ties felt frayed to the point of snapping. I replayed Miles's words over and over in my head. How Sharon and Elliot had plotted the evening, timing each drink, ensuring I would be pliable when they led me upstairs to the guest bedroom, where lawyers were waiting with documents that would strip away everything I had built over 4 decades. The arrogance of it was staggering. Not just the belief that I could be fooled so easily, but that my own daughter could orchestrate something so cold-blooded against her father. My hand tightened against my thigh as the cab turned down Maple Street, the driver oblivious to the war building in my chest. I thought about those lawyers upstairs, probably sipping wine and checking their watches, expecting their mark to arrive any minute, smiling politely as they explained where I needed to sign. They would have witnessed my signature, made it all neat and legal, And by the time I sobered up enough to realize what I'd done, the company would have been theirs. My name, my reputation, my livelihood gone. And all the while, Sharon would have smiled, pretended she was helping me pass the torch, while pocketing the benefits for herself and Elliot. The thought was so sharp it almost made me laugh, but there was no humor in it. There was only the kind of cold resolve that had seen me through contract disputes, dishonest suppliers, and the lean years when every dollar had to be fought for. The taxi slowed as we approached my house, the familiar shape of the porch coming into view under the dim streetlight. I paid the driver, stepped out, and the night air closed around me, cool and quiet except for the faint hum of Mrs. Henderson's television next door. Unlocking my front door, I stepped into the stillness of my home, setting my jacket and keys on the table with deliberate care. The house smelled faintly of coffee from earlier, grounding me in a way I needed right now. I walked into my study, flicked on the lamp, and stood there for a moment staring at the filing cabinet in the corner. It was more than just storage. It was an archive of every major decision I had made, every contract signed, every risk calculated. And tucked within those drawers were the records of every disaster Sharon had engineered or stumbled into. Records I'd kept not out of malice, but because experience had taught me that paper trails matter. I thought about retrieving them right then, but another thought took precedence. Miles. I picked up my phone and called him again, half expecting him not to answer with the party still in full swing, but he picked up on the first ring, his voice low. "Grandpa, I'm home." I told him, my voice steady. "I want you to remember everything you heard, exactly as you heard it. Don't add, don't leave out. We might need to put it in writing later." "I remember it all," he said. They were in the kitchen yesterday afternoon. Mom was making a list of wines and telling Dad how much to pour for you before they took you upstairs. She said you'd be too relaxed to care what you were signing. Dad kept saying it was the perfect way to solve their money problems. And they mentioned the lawyers? Yes. Mom said they'd be in the guest room, ready to go, so you wouldn't have time to think about it. His voice wavered for just a second, and I realized how much pressure he was under living in that house, keeping this secret from two people who had already proven what they were capable of. "You've done more for me tonight than you know," I told him. "And I promise you, I'll handle the rest. But you keep your head down. If they start asking you questions, play dumb. Let them think nothing's changed." "I can do that," he said. "I just didn't want them to get away with it." "They won't," I said, and the certainty in my voice was as much for him as it was for me. We hung up, and I sat there in the study, the quiet pressing in on me. My mind moved through the last week in sequence. Tuesday's argument about money, Wednesday's tire sabotage, Thursday night's party, tonight's almost trap. None of it was coincidence. This was a campaign, coordinated and deliberate, and the target had been me from the beginning. They had underestimated me, mistaking patience for weakness, civility for naivety. But I had not built my company by being easy to outmaneuver. I had built it by knowing when to act and when to wait, by recognizing patterns before others saw them. And now I saw the pattern clearly. I rose from my chair and went to the kitchen, making coffee even though it was late, the act itself a ritual that steadied my thoughts. As the machine gurgled, I stared out the window into the dark yard, thinking about every lever I could pull, every contact I could call, every document I could compile to dismantle whatever credibility Sharon and Elliot still had. They had tried to play a long game tonight, but I had been playing mine for 40 years. I poured the coffee, the steam rising into the lamplight, and took a slow sip, letting the bitterness settle me. I would not confront them tomorrow, not the day after. No, first I would gather, prepare, and ensure that when I moved, there would be no escape for them. They would learn, in a way they could never forget, that family loyalty is not a shield against accountability. My coffee sat cooling beside me, untouched while I stared at the dark surface of a liquid as if it might hold the answer to the question I couldn't shake. How far was my daughter willing to go? I had an appointment at Morrison's to check on my car's new tires, but something in me dragged my feet. Instead, I lingered over the kitchen counter, the weight of the previous days pressing against me like a physical hand on my shoulder. Eventually, I stepped outside, the chill biting more than the temperature justified, and started toward the driveway. That was when I noticed Ruth Henderson sitting on her porch, as she often did in the mornings, her shawl pulled snug around her shoulders and her eyes fixed not on the street but on me. She didn't raise her hand to wave as she usually did, and that alone made me slow my pace. Her wicker chair creaked as she leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and when I was close enough, she spoke in a voice that carried across the narrow strip of lawn between our houses without her having to raise it much. "Glenn," she said, her tone low and deliberate, "I think you should know what really happened to your tires." I stopped halfway down the walkway, the sound of a distant lawnmower filling the silence for a beat before I answered. "What do you mean, Ruth?" She straightened and came to the porch railing, leaning slightly as if she wanted to be sure no one else could overhear. "I was sitting out here Tuesday evening," she said. "You know how I like the evening air. I saw Sharon leaving your house around 9:30. She walked around your car with something in her hand. Looked like she was checking each tire. Then she knelt down by one, did something, stood up, and moved to the next. She went all the way around." Her words landed with the heavy thud of confirmation, and though my face didn't move, I felt the heat rise in my chest. "Are you certain it was her?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Ruth's expression didn't waver. "Glenn, I've known your girl since she was little. I know what I saw. She didn't see me because I keep my porch light off in the evenings. Easier to see the stars that way." I stood there, hands in my pockets, the whole scene unfolding in my mind exactly as she described it. Sharon leaving after our heated argument, her steps carrying her not to her car in a rush of temper, but to mine, circling it like a predator measuring its prey, methodically inflicting damage she could later dismiss as the work of faceless vandals. "This was right after I heard raised voices from your house," Ruth continued. "Not that I was trying to listen, but sound carries on quiet nights." She paused, her gaze steady. "I wasn't sure if I should mention it, family matters being delicate, but when I saw you with those expensive new tires, I thought you should know the truth." I exhaled slowly, a controlled release of the anger building inside. Here it was, laid bare, not just a suspicion born of pattern recognition, not just circumstantial timing, but a witnessed act, deliberate and calculated. It wasn't desperation or a moment's rash decision. It was part of a sequence, a coordinated campaign that had moved from financial manipulation to property destruction to the attempted legal theft of my life's work. And I was certain now that she would have carried it further if not for Miles's intervention. "Let's keep this between us for now," I told Ruth, my voice even but firm. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "But that girl needs to learn some respect for what you've built. You've worked too hard to have someone, family or not, tear it down out of spite." Her words carried the weight of 40 years of neighborly observation, of watching Sharon grow from a child with promise to a woman making choices that had led her here. "If you ever need me to verify what I saw," Ruth added, "I'm not afraid to tell the truth." I nodded, the gesture small but sincere. "I appreciate that, Ruth." I turned and continued to the driveway, looking at the car with its pristine new tires, each one a silent testament to the malice that had shredded the old set. In that moment, the last traces of doubt vanished. Sharon's plan had never been about one single act. It had been about softening me up from every angle, undermining me piece by piece until I was vulnerable enough to take. Back inside, I walked straight to my study, sat down at the desk, and opened the folder again, the pages spreading across the wood in a fan of poor decisions and lost money. Miami condos, cryptocurrency, food truck, now vandalism, legal fraud. Every line of ink and every figure was another step in a staircase she had built for herself, one that climbed directly over my trust. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a moment, the slow tick of the clock marking the space between decision and action. I knew what had to come next. There was no room for confrontation fueled by emotion. This would have to be methodical, strategic, and final. They had declared war. I would answer in kind, but I would answer with precision, not noise. I gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, and reached for a notepad. Names began to fill the page. Contacts in the business community, people who still respected me, people who would be interested to know the kind of risk Sharon represented. My coffee steamed beside me on the desk as I unlocked the filing cabinet again and pulled out not just the thick folder labeled Sharon Investments 2016-2024, but also the secondary folders where I had tucked away correspondence, receipts, and notes on each fiasco. I spread them across the desk in chronological order, the paper edges overlapping like a timeline of destruction. I handled each one with the same care I would give to blueprints before a major build, because that was what this was now, a construction project of a different kind, one that would be built on truth, documented fact, and precise delivery. First was the Miami condo disaster. The glossy marketing packets promising sweeping ocean views and endless rental income. I had the contract Sharon signed, the bank transfer records showing the $80,000 she'd invested, and more importantly, the emails from the developer to Sharon hinting at pending bankruptcy before the final round of investor funds was collected. I also had the statement from Marshall Keene, a fellow business owner in Lewin who had trusted her enough to put in $25,000 of his own money on her recommendation. His loss had been just as complete, and though we had only spoken briefly about it at the time, I knew he'd never forgiven the sting of being misled by someone connected to my name. Next was the cryptocurrency mining scheme, a fiasco that had unfolded like a textbook case in online fraud. Sharon had sent $50,000 to a supposed equipment supplier in Nevada she met on a forum, convinced she was buying into the next gold rush. I had copies of the sleek website they had shown her, photos of massive mining rigs humming in dimly lit warehouses. Images I later discovered were stolen from unrelated businesses. The supplier had gone silent the moment the wire cleared, and the site vanished without a trace. Derek Salazar, a sharp investor who chaired our local investment group, had put in $35,000 alongside her, and I had the email where Sharon admitted to him privately that the supplier looked a little questionable, but that she thought the returns were too good to pass up. Finally, the food truck venture, the one I had been most wary of from the start. Sharon had gone into business with a man I knew to have a conviction for embezzlement, a fact she had waved away as irrelevant. She'd persuaded Tanya Whitfield, a respected financial consultant in town, to put in $20,000 for startup costs. 3 months later, the partner disappeared with the truck, the equipment, and what was left of the funds. I had the signed partnership agreement that included a background check clause Sharon ignored, along with Tanya's increasingly frustrated text messages when she realized she'd been abandoned with nothing to show for it. I created 3 large manila envelopes, one for each of them, Marshall, Derek, and Tanya. Inside each, I placed the relevant contracts, financial records, and correspondence, along with a simple cover letter printed in a neutral font on plain paper. Information for your consideration regarding Sharon Caraway's business practices. Please review the attached documentation and draw your own conclusions. No accusations, no commentary, just the facts. It was important they came to their own judgments because judgments people arrive at themselves sink deeper and spread further than anything forced on them. I sealed the envelopes, marked them for hand delivery, and set them aside. The next step was ensuring they reached their destinations without a trace back to me. I called Premier Courier Service, a professional outfit I'd used in the past when discretion was required, and arranged for same-day delivery to all three addresses. The dispatcher confirmed cash payment at pickup and noted that they handled anonymous sender requests regularly. The timing had to be perfect. Late Friday afternoon delivery meant my targets would have the weekend to pore over the documents and, crucially, to contact one another. By Monday morning, the story would be running its course through Lewin's tightly knit business circles, and the damage to Sharon's credibility would be irreversible. At 2:30, the courier arrived. I handed over the envelopes, the bills folded neatly in my palm, and watched from the window as the driver pulled away. A satisfaction settled over me, not the hot rush of revenge, but the cold assurance of a plan set in motion exactly as intended. I could picture Marshall sitting in his office, tearing open the envelope and frowning as he saw the familiar contracts. Derek at his kitchen table, spreading out the emails and bank records. Tanya reading the partnership agreement and remembering the sting of betrayal. And then, inevitably, one of them would pick up the phone and call another, realizing they weren't alone, that Sharon's pattern wasn't a string of bad luck, but a deliberate trail of negligence and deceit. By mid-evening, I imagined the first quiet conversations beginning, cautious but pointed, probing to confirm details. Over the weekend, those conversations would multiply, the network working the way it always did, connecting people who otherwise moved in different circles. And by the time the first workday began, the warning would be in place. Do not trust Sharon Caraway with your money. At 3:15, my phone buzzed with a call from Sharon. I played the part of man who was just now being informed, giving polite, vague answers, but I knew exactly what was happening. Marshall had reached out to Derek over the weekend. Derek had spoken to Tanya, and by Sunday evening, they had collectively pulled in several others from their networks. In Lewin's tight business community, that kind of triangulation moved faster than any formal press release. By the time I poured my second cup of coffee, I was certain that the first phase of my plan had landed exactly as intended. Sharon's reputation as an investor, and by extension as a business partner, was now a cautionary tale being passed over lunch meetings and evening drinks. That alone would have been enough to keep her out of legitimate deals for years, but it wasn't enough for me. Sharon hadn't worked alone, and Elliot had been just as present in that kitchen, just as complicit in the calculated attempt to strip me of everything I owned. If Sharon's downfall was built on the slow erosion of her credibility, Elliot's would be built on a targeted strike at the very position that gave him any power at all. He worked as a senior client relationship manager at Pinnacle Financial Consulting, a firm that specialized in managing high net worth accounts. His entire livelihood rested on two things: trust and perception. If either of those were compromised, his position would become untenable almost overnight. I began by reaching out to a few old contacts under the guise of catching up. Conversations that started with idle talk about construction costs and local politics gradually shifted toward the financial sector. It didn't take long to start hearing Elliot's name in connection with certain habits. More than one source mentioned seeing him at the Marriott Lounge on weekday afternoons, always with the same sharply dressed man who, according to his wedding ring, was married but not to anyone in Lewin. They described long conversations over expensive bottles of wine during hours when Elliot should have been serving clients. That alone wouldn't be enough to bring him down, but it was the kind of detail that hinted at distractions, at potential conflicts of interest, at improprieties that could be woven into a larger narrative. The spending patterns were even more telling. Despite Sharon's constant talk about financial strain, Elliot had been buying high-end clothing, jewelry, and electronics in the last 6 months, items that didn't match the income he claimed to have. I had receipts in my possession already, ones I had seen when Sharon had bragged about his taste for the finer things. Combined with the birthday party's display of excess, it painted a picture of someone living well beyond his declared means. And in his industry, that picture could be fatal. I drafted the ethics complaint with the precision of a legal brief, choosing each word for its ability to raise questions without crossing into outright accusation. The opening paragraph established Elliot's role at Pinnacle and the trust required of anyone in his position. The second laid out, in clinical detail, his participation in an attempted fraud against an elderly family member, me, through the use of alcohol and legal deception, a scheme that had been interrupted only by the intervention of a third party. I was careful to phrase it as a matter of professional conduct, noting that such behavior reflected a fundamental disregard for client welfare and fiduciary duty. From there, I included the supporting details, documented evidence of lavish spending inconsistent with known income, witness accounts of extended absences during work hours in the company of a non-client, and photographs of the extravagant catering, decor, and alcohol served at the recent party that coincided with the attempted fraud. These were presented not as accusations, but as matters warranting internal review, the kind of red flags any responsible firm would be compelled to investigate. The packet was thick by the time I was done, each section tabbed for easy reference, each piece of evidence printed cleanly and without any identifying marks that could tie it back to me. I placed the documents in a plain envelope with no return address and arranged for Premier Courier to handle delivery, this time to the HR director of Pinnacle Financial. The timing was deliberate, delivered Monday afternoon, giving them the rest of the week to initiate their investigation, question Elliot's colleagues, and begin pulling his client files for audit. As the courier's van pulled away from the curb, I felt that same cold satisfaction I had experienced after sending the first 3 packages. I didn't need to know exactly when Elliot would be called into a meeting, handed the complaint, and told to explain himself. I just needed to know it would happen, and that the questions would be the kind he couldn't easily answer without implicating himself further. For the rest of the day, I went about my business as usual, making calls for a small renovation project I'd been considering, stopping by Morrison's to check on a delivery, even grabbing lunch at the diner without so much as a second glance toward my phone. This wasn't a time to hover over developments. This was the time to let the machinery turn on its own. The damage had been set in motion, and like any chain reaction, it would gather momentum without my interference. That evening, just as I was settling into my chair with a book, I heard the sound I'd been expecting. A car pulling into my driveway too fast, doors slamming, footsteps coming up the walk in sharp bursts. When I opened the door, there they were, Sharon and Elliot, side by side, both wearing expressions that blended anger with a thin edge of fear. "We need to talk," Sharon said, her voice tight. Elliot added, "We know what you've been doing." I stepped aside, gestured them into the living room, and took my seat in the armchair while they stood, too agitated to sit. "You've destroyed my business relationships," Sharon snapped. "Marshall, Derek, and Tanya all got the same packet about old investments you funded years ago." Elliot's voice was lower, but carried a sharper edge. "My employer received an ethics complaint today. HR is conducting an investigation into my professional conduct and client relationships. They had details no one should have." I listened without interrupting, my face calm, my hands folded loosely in my lap. When they had both finished, I said evenly, "What you're facing now is the direct result of your own actions. If I pushed too hard, they'd both turn their attention back toward me, closing ranks again. But if I was careful, if I made the information look like it had simply fallen into their laps, they'd direct their suspicions inward, convinced the other was playing a double game." I started with Sharon. On Wednesday morning, an unmarked envelope found its way into her office inbox. Inside was a single printed photograph. Elliot seated at the Marriott Lounge, leaning in toward the married man I'd already heard about, a glass of wine in his hand and a briefcase at his feet. On the back, in block letters, was written, "Lunch break" or "business meeting." No name, no return address, no other context. Just enough to make her ask questions. I didn't have to be in the room to know the effect it would have. Sharon had always prided herself on being aware of every move her partners made, and to find out about this from an anonymous source would hit her pride in just the right place. For Elliot, the approach had to be different. He was already under formal scrutiny, which meant any new information could feel like a lifeline or a dagger. Late Thursday afternoon, while he was still at work, his personal email received an anonymous message with a subject line that read, "You should see this." Inside was a PDF attachment labeled Investor Summary Q2. The document was a carefully doctored set of meeting notes from one of Sharon's past investor luncheons, with a section that appeared to show her discussing a contingency plan in case Pinnacle's investigation into Elliot resulted in his suspension or termination. The notes ended with a line that read, "If Elliot becomes a liability, we pivot without him." It was just vague enough to be believable and just specific enough to feel like a betrayal. I didn't need to imagine his reaction. I'd already seen the way his jaw tightened when Sharon interrupted him in mid-sentence, the way his eyes flickered toward her whenever bad news came up. I knew that under the right pressure, those glances would sharpen into accusations. By Friday, my plan was already working its way into motion. A contact of mine who worked in the same building as Sharon called to tell me he had overheard a heated conversation in her office. The words weren't clear through the frosted glass, but the tone was unmistakable, sharp, rapid, defensive. Later that day, another friend texted me from the parking lot outside Pinnacle to say that Elliot had been seen getting into his car with an expression like he was ready to break something. He didn't head home. He drove straight to the downtown district where Sharon kept her private consulting suite. What happened inside, I could only speculate, but I didn't need details. The next step was predictable. On Saturday afternoon, I sat at the diner with a copy of the Lewin Daily folded under my coffee cup and watched as they walked in together. Not side by side, but one after the other, their movements stiff, their greetings to acquaintances strained. Sharon ordered tea without looking at Elliot. He spent most of the meal scrolling on his phone. The space between them wasn't just physical, it was the visible outline of distrust. I knew it wouldn't be long before they confronted each other about the leaks. And when they did, neither would admit to being the source, because neither believed the other enough to tell the truth. That night, I made the final move to lock the division in place. Using an old prepaid phone I'd kept for months, I sent Elliot a short text from an untraceable number. Ask Sharon why she met with Morgan Green without you. Morgan Green was an investor Sharon had courted years ago, known for backing competitors if the terms were right. In reality, Sharon hadn't seen Morgan in years, but I knew the name would spark a reaction. Then I sent Sharon a different message from the same phone. Elliot's been talking to Pinnacle's compliance team without legal counsel. Ask him why. Both messages were calculated to trigger the same feeling. Fear that the other was making deals behind their back. By Sunday morning, the split was complete. I learned from another quiet observer that Elliot had shown up late to a planned meeting with Sharon, only to leave after 15 minutes, slamming the door hard enough that people in the hall stopped what they were doing. Sharon, in turn, had begun reaching out to mutual contacts, fishing for information about Elliot's behavior at work. By the time the sun went down, they weren't partners in survival anymore. They were liabilities to each other. I knew this ending had to be different from the stages before, because winning wasn't just about making them lose, it was about ensuring the lesson would linger long after I was gone from their lives. They had thrived for years by feeding off others, stripping away dignity, leveraging vulnerability, crushing anyone who couldn't fight back. It wasn't enough to watch them turn on each other. I needed to make sure they understood what it felt like to stand in the ruins they'd built for someone else. For the final act, I didn't send another anonymous note or leak another document. I invited them both to the same place under different pretenses without either knowing the other would be there. I chose an abandoned municipal hall on the east side, one they both knew from old fundraising events. Its walls were still lined with faded banners that read "Community First," and I wanted that irony to hang in the air like dust in the light streaming through broken windows. Elliot arrived first, his suit jacket wrinkled, eyes darting around the empty space like he expected cameras to be hidden somewhere. Sharon came 5 minutes later, her heels echoing sharply against the cracked tile. The moment they saw each other, their shoulders stiffened, and for a second I could see that same instinct to retreat into accusations. Before they could speak, I stepped out from behind the stage curtain, not with triumph or gloating, but with the calm of someone who had already won. They both froze, eyes locked on me, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of a dramatic reveal. Instead, I set 2 manila folders on the center table, one in front of each of them. Inside Elliot's was a timeline, a precise, documented chain of every action he had taken in the past 6 months, cross-referenced with evidence of how Sharon had maneuvered around him, all without his knowledge. Inside Sharon's was her own mirrored version, each undercutting move Elliot had made to safeguard himself, all sourced from her own trusted network. Neither file contained anything that wasn't already true, but seeing it organized, laid bare, stripped of the lies they had told themselves. That was the final blow. For a long moment, they said nothing. Their eyes scanned the pages, their faces shifting from denial to disbelief to something closer to quiet dread. I told them that I hadn't fabricated anything, that everything in those folders had come from their own words, their own decisions. They didn't ask how I had gotten it. They didn't accuse me of manipulation. They simply sat there, trapped in the knowledge that the person they had relied on most had always been working toward their undoing. I could have left then, satisfied, but I wasn't done. I told them about the people they'd stepped on over the years, the interns who quit after 1 week, the vendors they underpaid, the clients they misled. I named names, dates, places, so there was no escaping the truth. And then I told them the part that mattered most, that the reason they were sitting here, broken and mistrusting, wasn't because I was smarter or more ruthless. It was because they had built their entire world on using people instead of trusting them. And in the end, that made them easy to split apart. Neither of them spoke, but I could see in their eyes that they understood. I didn't need an apology, and I knew I would never get one. The point wasn't to repair anything. It was to leave them with a weight of their own history, a weight they couldn't put down no matter how far they ran from it. I left the hall without looking back, my footsteps echoing in the same rhythm as Sharon's heels and Elliot's polished shoes had minutes earlier. The air outside was sharp with the smell of rain, the streets slick under a low gray sky. I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. Free from the shadow they had cast over my life. Free from the need to prove anything to people who had already shown me exactly who they were. In the weeks that followed, I heard that Pinnacle's investigation had concluded. Elliot had been quietly removed from his position, his reputation too tarnished to recover. Sharon's consulting firm lost 2 major clients, both citing concerns about internal stability, and she faded from the industry press entirely. They didn't reconcile. I doubted they even spoke again. As for me, I went back to the quiet life I had before they'd try to strip it away. I worked, I read, I rebuilt. But the difference now was that I carried no illusions. People like them would always exist, but so would people like me. People who knew how to turn the tables when pushed too far. And maybe, just maybe, Somewhere in the back of their minds, Sharon and Elliot would remember that moment in the municipal hall, the folders laid out like mirrors they couldn't look away from, and understand that the real defeat wasn't losing to me. It was realizing they'd been losing to themselves all along. The end. If you've stayed with me until the end, you know this wasn't just a story about revenge. It was about showing two people exactly what they had become and making sure they could never go back to pretending otherwise. I told it the way I lived it, because every detail mattered, every move had weight, and every silence carried more than words ever could. If you felt the tension build with each stage, if you pictured that last meeting and the way the truth sat between them like a loaded weapon, then I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you think about how it ended. Was it justice or was it simply inevitable? Where in the world are you listening to this right now? I'd like to know how far this story has traveled and what it makes you feel. If you want more stories told from the inside with every twist, every motive, every consequence laid bare, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It's the best way to let me know these kinds of stories matter to you, and it helps me keep bringing them to life. Now, I'll leave you with this. Sometimes the most powerful ending isn't the one that explodes in chaos. It's the one that leaves the people who caused the damage sitting alone with the truth, knowing there's no way out.